Richard, I'm excited to be visiting with you, brother. The work that you're doing, is a play on things that we've covered tremendously through the Sowing Prosperity platform with Gabe and Alan and so many incredible people in the regenerative agriculture space. So, if you don't care, give us that introduction to who you are and what you do with Regenified.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much, Logan, for having me on your podcast. I've been a fan of Sowing Prosperity for a while now, so it's a real treat for me to be here. My name's Richard Tufton. I'm the Vice President of Supply Chain for Pastured Proteins for Regenified, and the mission is to try to turn the world's food supply into regenerative agriculture. And Regenified, one of the people out there trying to do that. It was set up by Gabe and Alan and Doug Peterson, and we'll get into that a bit more as we talk. But my personal story is as you can tell from my weird accent, not a Austin, Texas native, which is where I live right now. I've been here for about 9 years, but I grew up in the UK, studied agriculture, went into work for a slaughtering and fab plant to really learn from the ground up how the meat world works. How do you turn cattle and sheep into steaks and burgers? And so I guess the first kind of third of my career was spent doing all of the jobs to really learn every step of that process. And then the more I learned, the more I knew what my kind of life mission was to try to improve that, try to focus on the best way possible of producing the highest quality meat, grounded in truth and traceability. And that's really part of the reason why I moved to the States, was to try, those big, huge feedlots aren't really a thing in the UK. And I learned about them through a really good book actually called Steak by someone called Mark Schatzker. And in that book, Mark travels the world and he tries steak in different cities and then tracks that back to the origin of where that steak came from. What breed of animal was it? What did it eat? What was its welfare? And there's a really good chapter where he goes to a steakhouse in New York, Peter Luger's, I think it was, and he traces that back to a feedlot in Texas. And anyway, he brings with him Alan Williams on his journey. And that was how that was one of my entry points into this world. And they look into what a feedlot is and why it does what it does. And Alan is obviously singing the praises of grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And so, yeah, I kind of got into that whole world. And then I went down the Alan Williams rabbit hole, which then got me into all kinds of weird and wonderful regenerative places. I've listened to way too many podcasts and read all the books, and that got me into Gabe Brown, and then I reached out to Gabe a year or so ago and just gradually became friends with him. And actually the turning point came when we went over to the UK and met up with some young regenerative farmers that were converting from conventional agriculture to regenerative. And it was on that trip earlier this year that we really saw the potential of the UK market and it being ready for Regenified and regenerative product to hit the supermarket shelves. And on that trip, Waitrose, which is one of the leading supermarkets in the UK, who has about 350 stores, something like that, they made a commitment to be 100% regenerative by 2035. And probably a lot of your listeners might not have heard of Waitrose, but think of them as the kind of Wegmans, maybe Whole Foods equivalent. It's kind of top tier, really good quality supermarket. And I think they're making a statement that I really hope others will look at and follow in due course. And that was kind of the moment where Gabe, very kindly offered me the opportunity to work for him to try to set up that supply chain. Gabe's built up this amazing network of farms and farmers who are already raising food regeneratively. But one of the components that needs a bit more help is just that connectivity of connecting the farm to whoever's going to be consuming that meat, whether it's a restaurant, a supermarket or an ingredient manufacturer. And that's really what my role is in this process, to try to kind of empower everybody in that supply chain to want to get involved in this space. That was a really long introduction. I'm sorry, but yeah,
I love it.
that's who
I
I am.
the 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 food chain aspect of all of this is so important to be focusing on, because that's the only way it really works. The farmers can do everything right and do just this bang up job. And if we can't connect it to the consumer in an efficient way, it doesn't really matter. So like anybody that's watching the video or hear some background noises, we had a power pole taken out right before we got started in front of the market. So we have no power and we're just trying to make it work. But chickens, a little bit of traffic, hopefully it isn't too bad. But Richard, the group that you're working with is really being at the forefront of exposure and creating awareness around the movement. You know, Gabe with Dirt to Soil, Alan's been around a long time. So what about them do you feel like gives an edge to a certification like Regenified? How can their work be a big boost for what you're doing, especially in the eyes of the consumer?
Yeah, great question. I mean, well, just to come back on what you said before I answer that question, you talked about the supply chain, and I think it's a really important concept that a chain works by being pulled on, not pushed. If you've ever tried pushing a chain, it doesn't really get you anywhere. So, and I've definitely wasted a lot of my career trying to push concepts like this through the supply chain, starting at the farm end. So for this movement to catch fire, you've really got to empower the consumer who's picking up the product from the shelf, and also the brands and the supermarket buyers to want to put these products on the shelf. And that's really going to pull that through the supply chain. But to answer your question, the edge that we have, I believe, is that Regenified was set up by farmers. So Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, Doug Peterson, they're all farmers. And this is designed to do two main things. One is to meet farmers where they're at. So it doesn't really matter where you are on your regenerative journey. You're welcome to be verified with Regenified. And what we will do is we will help you learn more about your farm and your soil than probably you've known before. And you can only manage what you know. And so we're going to give you all this extra information about your land to hopefully help you become a better farmer of your free inputs, the inputs that cost nothing, the sunshine, the rainfall, and the air. And by learning some of these processes, you're going to become much better at that. So with farmers having set this up, the benefit is all designed at you, the farmer. So it's designed to help you use those free inputs. And with that, you can reduce your reliance on expensive inputs, all of the herbicides, pesticides, the glyphosates, which probably a lot of farmers have been using for a long time because maybe they thought that was the only way. Well, there are definitely alternative ways, and we're starting to learn. Alan's career really has been proving that agriculture is not a chemical equation. I mean, I went to university 25 years ago and learned that you put chemicals in, you get yield out, and that's basically how farming works. The more chemicals, the more yield, the more yield, the more money. But actually, chemicals are extremely expensive. And many times farmers can't make that financial model work. And so it's about taking all of Alan's learnings, all of Gabe's learnings, all of Doug's learnings, and put them into this verification to try to give farmers all this extra information to help them become more resilient. Because if you're on this journey with Regenified, you're going to learn how to make better use of rainfall. Infiltration rates are a huge deal. And that word infiltration rate is all about how much water gets absorbed by your soil during a rainfall event. And unfortunately, I mean, perfect soil should be about 60% airspace in amongst those aggregates. And oftentimes a collapsed soil due to excess tillage for multiple years will mean that there is not that space within the soil to absorb the water. So you talk about infiltration rates and how many inches of rain you can absorb per hour. And most farmland here in the States is about half an inch per hour. So that's half an inch of rainfall per hour. And I live in Austin, Texas, where a typical rain event won't be frequent, but it will always be heavy. And we will receive, maybe 2 inches in an hour. And very few soils around where I live can absorb that. Well, when Gabe took over his farm, his land could absorb half an inch per hour, and now it can absorb 32 inches per hour. Now, he lives in North Dakota, where the annual rainfall, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like 8 inches or 9 inches. It's not very, so he can absorb way more than will ever fall on his land, which means that he knows that every single drop of rain that falls on his land is being absorbed. It's not flowing sideways into the rivers and streams and taking any kind of toxicity or pollution. It's all being absorbed into his land, and that will stay there and be available to the roots of the plants that he's growing. And whilst we're on a bit of a tangent here, but talking about infiltration, it does make me think about, the recent hurricanes that we've received and how much devastation, someone like Asheville, North Carolina received, and they had 28 inches of rainfall in a couple of days. Well, it's an interesting thing to think about, that if every one of those farms surrounding Asheville had been Gabe Brown's farm, probably the devastation would have been lessened significantly, because that water would have been able to be absorbed into the soil. An infiltration rate is only one of the many things that we look at. We actually give farmers about 68 different data points per field, per farm. Infiltration rate is just one of them, but we're looking at soil organic matter, about carbon. We're looking at biodiversity. How many species of grass does your pasture have if you're feeding livestock? And so we give a whole suite of information to really help the farmer improve the biological cycles that are happening on their farm.
Richard, for most farmers, what's the biggest pushback? Where's the skepticism on making a change? Why didn't everybody just jump on it?
Well, this is Alan's words, not me, but he often talks about the biggest area of compaction as the 6 inches between a farmer's ears. And a lot of this stuff has been ingrained through generations. And, farmers farm. And by the way, I want to be clear, I don't criticize any farmer out there for ever using glyphosate or tilling, because that's how everybody was taught to do it. And that's what the market forces told farmers. We want as much yield as possible. And to get that, we want you to use as many chemicals as you see fit. And we want you to till the soil, and we want you to get those yields as high as you can get them. And I don't criticize any farmer for going on that journey. But what we're realizing now is that there is a better way. And so I think the biggest challenge is, question one is always, well, what's my return on investment? So Regenified is set up the verification, having a human come out onto your farm and do all the poking and prodding to get all this data, that costs money, right? And so what we have to show to the farmers is the value that provides. And really that value is threefold. So one, we're going to help you save input costs. So you've got farmers like Rick Clark in Indiana. Since becoming Regenified and learning more about his land, he's saved about $2.70 per acre, and he farms 10,000 acres. And that's a significant chunk of money. Now, he's obviously got a lot of acres, so that value is quite large in terms of the total amount, but per acre, he's saved $2.70. And savings like that are more than possible as you go on your journey from conventional to regenerative. So that's the first thing, is literally the cost of producing the food that you're producing. We want to train farmers to farm for profit and not farming for yield. And there's a big difference on that, because so many farmers that I know personally are chasing the highest yield they can possibly get. And that's kind of their badge of honor when they're down at the pub with their friends after harvest. You know, that's what they're bragging about, is what their yields are. But really, they should be bragging about their bank balances. And chasing those high yields is very rarely doesn't go hand in hand with profit. So that's the first thing to do. Cut back your input costs and you will see a higher profit on your farm. And the second thing is the rule of compounding, like compounding different businesses onto your acre of land. So for each acre, maybe you grow a crop of corn or grain. And then once the combine passes through, you've got a cover crop that's already there, green and ready for some livestock to come on. And maybe behind them comes some sheep, and maybe behind them come some chickens, some laying hens. And maybe you've got some bees that you can sell the honey, and just the idea of kind of compounding different enterprises. I mean, really, it's kind of the way that our grandparents or great grandparents used to do it, moving away from this idea of monoculture, monocropping, one crop across your whole farm or across your whole field, and replacing that concept with the diversity of lots of different business ventures per acre. And that will result in higher productivity per acre of food that you're producing. And really that right there is the answer to the question, can regenerative agriculture feed the world? Yeah, it definitely can, because I know that on the 1 acre of land that a conventional monocropping farmer will farm, he'll get 1 crop per calendar cycle. And that's great. And it will be a well-yielded crop, I'm sure. But on a regenerative farm, you'll get that 1 crop, which, let's say it might be a slightly lower yield than the other guy. But then after that, you've got your cattle coming through, you've got your sheep, you've got your chickens, there's the bees and the honey. These are all different types of food coming from that same acre in that same calendar year. So that is the answer to if this is scalable and if this is going to be able to feed the world. Unquestionably, yes. The biggest challenge is that compaction between the ears, you know what I mean? So those are 2 of the things. Then the third thing which we're working on is the supply chain piece, matching up the farmers and growers with marketplaces who care about this stuff. And some of those marketplaces are relatively straightforward because it's quite a closed loop system, something like an olive grove that goes into producing bottles of olive oil. That's quite straightforward. And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum something with high complexity, which is the world that I'm in, which is the beef and livestock world, where oftentimes you might have 3 separate farms that a cow calf will be the first farm, and then there'll be a separate farm location, which in the States they call a backgrounder, taking the cattle through their teenage years. And then there'll be a third farm location, which will be the finisher. In other words, getting that animal ready for slaughter. And that becomes a much more complex equation, combined with the fact that after slaughter, you're taking one thing and breaking it up into multiple pieces. And you have to make sure that each of those pieces gets sold for a profit. So there's a whole spectrum of complexities. And we're trying to work with farmers really that grow anything from soil. We're interested in helping you be connected to your marketplace and really have the marketplace be connected with you and help you tell your story and your narrative and really engage and connect with the person who's buying that food at the end of the chain.
Yeah, regenerative agriculture seems like one of the top ways of decentralizing the food. And you talk about that stacking of enterprises and being able to get more out of the acre. I think that's so important. So it's easy for me, but I'm trying to frame that question. What do we do to prevent greenwashing with regenerative agriculture? Because it's coming, right? Like, so organic, as pure and wonderful as it was as it came out, it's been greenwashed, right? It's been taken over, used in ways that it wasn't intended. So for Regenified specifically as a certification for regenerative agriculture, it's very easy for me because I know y'all, right? Like I've known y'all for a long time and I know what you stand for and why you're doing it. But how do we keep that pure mission from getting bastardized? How do we keep it on point to where it is a trusted logo for the long term and not just because I'm concerned what regenerative agriculture is going to be in another 5 years as a main topic. So what are y'all looking at doing to maintain that credibility?
Yeah, well, a really good question. It's a big one. I mean, Regenified was set up for many reasons. One of the main ones, though, is to prevent greenwashing, to prevent that narrative, to prevent farmers like you who are raising food regeneratively and prevent you from having to compete with farmers that are raising food in different ways out in the marketplace. When we verify a farm, we get all of this data, and that provides you with kind of like an a la carte menu, is how I like to think of it. There'll be some things on that menu which the farmer will care about. There'll be some things on that menu which the supermarket, the ingredient manufacturer will care about because they'll be writing their ESG Scope 3 reports. And let's be clear, every single boardroom in the country, across the world, in the food space is being asked, is your business sustainable? And many of those businesses don't have an answer to that question. And regenerative agriculture has a lot of answers to help them answer that question. And so it's about connecting those folks with the data from farms, from their actual supply chain. And that's going to really help them understand the differences in regenerative agriculturally produced food compared to not. And then the a la carte menu idea, what about the consumers? How do we get them locked in to the idea of wanting regenerative agriculture products? Well, it's all about nutrient density testing, or, how nutrient rich is the food. And folks like Alan Williams and Stefan Van Fleet at the University of Utah, that's who Regenified, who we work in partnership with. So all of our growers have access to him and his amazing mass spectrometer, which, without getting too sciencey, is basically a way of measuring how much nutrient density is in a food. So you can take a ground beef sample from an animal that was produced regeneratively and a ground beef sample from a feedlot animal, for example, and you run them through this mass spectrometer, and that will tell you 3,000 data points of the phytonutrient makeup of that meat. And these are things like vitamins, minerals, proteins, the whole suite of things. But the level of phytonutrients and phytochemicals is directly related to flavor. And if food doesn't taste great, then people aren't going to buy it. And so what that does is two things. One, it will guarantee a better eating experience for the consumer who consumes that food and want them to buy it again. But it will also give the brand or the supermarket an opportunity to take that data and put it on the side of the pack. There's a rice producer who well, who's just down the road from you, Tim Ralston, and has been able to put on his pack that he can get an extra, for one of the varieties he grows, he can get an extra 3 grams of protein per cup of his rice because it's raised regeneratively. And by the way, certified Regenified has got FSIS approval and USDA approval, the only one in the States currently as we're recording this. And so it's very easy for our farmers and growers and brands who interact with us to put this information on the pack, because remember what we said earlier about the supply chain only really working if you pull it. We need to make this as attractive as possible for a consumer to want to pick up these products. And the way to do that is to talk their language. And a consumer is not necessarily going to care about greenhouse gas emissions and carbon and water infiltration rates. That doesn't really mean anything to them. But what means something to them is they're pushing a shopping cart with 2 screaming kids in, and they've got 2 seconds to look at a product label and make a decision. If they see this one's going to give me an extra 3 grams of protein, well, that's going to fill up my kids and give them, nourishment. That's the one that I'm going to put in the trolley, in the cart. And it's being able to try to condense down the complexity of regenerative agriculture and all of the things that you and I know it helps, but how do you boil that down into simple, easy to understand metrics that your average consumer is going to engage with? Because remember, we want to try to convert the whole food supply chain to regenerative. And right now, I think the market is definitely there for the purists, people who worship at the Church of Gabe Brown, which I'm definitely one of them. But we want to expand that message sideways and start to welcome in all consumers who are interested in eating healthy food, and especially, you get into the topic of ultra processed food, and there are many food-like substances available in any grocery store once you start going to some of those middle aisles, and trying to encourage that connection between human health and the quality of food that we're eating, which is, that's another huge rabbit hole, which we don't need to go down now necessarily, but the connection between human health and food and we've worked very hard over the last, since World War II in reducing the price of food, but then at what cost? You look at how much we're spending on healthcare. Here in the States, it's something like 1.9 trillion per year, yet we're spending 1.5 trillion on food. And you think about what that was like 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that was reversed. And, you've had this personal journey that you've been on for that exact reason. And so there's such a strong connection there that, thanks to people like Gabe and Alan and making films and podcasts and books, people are starting to think about it and understand it. But we need, everything working in conjunction to really keep this movement growing, which it is, and making it available to everyone.
Yeah, you hit on taste, and so what we're up against is that we have food that tastes good, right? Because it's been chemically altered to, confuse us and make us think some of this garbage is actually delicious. And so all that been done in labs and through straight up propaganda and marketing. And so when you have a good tasting food that costs a whole lot more and you don't fully understand why, right? Based on it has a much higher nutrient density. It is a regeneratively raised product. That's a lot to overcome. And so like that education piece is huge. And that's why we tout what we do. That's why we send our meat off to Dr. Van Vliet to have tests. We want to know exactly what we're doing, right? Like it is actually making a difference. And with the recent changes, looking like with the administration stuff, we've got Kennedy coming in, really seems to be aligned with a lot of the health focused with food and what we're exposed to mission. So definitely something that I think is going to have a lot more awareness, and having some sort of a label that hey, this is at least online with how I'm trying to live. I think it does make it a lot easier for the consumer. And so I think that we got to continue these conversations and show why. And then that at some point, hopefully we hit that tipping point to where someone like the huge retailer you're working with in the UK or that's came out, it has a massive impact, because the best evangelists, I think, that we're going to have are the people that were sick, that they're feeling better because they've made some of these changes.
Yeah, I was just talking last week. I've already mentioned his name already, but Rick Clark in Indiana, and he's a farmer, a big farmer, arable farmer, but his personal story and is that he got type 2 diabetes, and he realized that what he was eating was different to the kind of food that he was raising on the farm. And so he managed to change his diet up, and now has been able to reverse a lot of the health symptoms that he was experiencing for his type 2 diabetes. And there are so many stories out there where eating food-like substance causes you significant challenges to your personal health. And if you reverse that and you start to eat better, how many times have you gone to a grocery store and bought an apple or tomato and you eat it and there's really nothing there? It doesn't taste of anything other than water, and it looks amazing when it's on the shelf. And we're trying to combat that. We're trying to give consumers food that is proper food that will nourish your body. And we want a tomato to taste like a tomato should. And I know you've had the guys on from Chef's Garden in Cleveland, Ohio, but folks like that who are growing vegetables regeneratively, if you try one of those tomatoes, I don't know if you've seen the kids movie Ratatouille, but there's a scene in that where this restaurant critic goes into this very fancy restaurant and really they've been trying to impress him with amazing food, but what he really wanted was ratatouille because that was what he had when he was a little kid. And he has this moment where he puts it in his mouth and instantly he gets transported back to what food used to taste like when he was little. And I actually recently went to Chef's Garden and I tried one of their tomatoes and I had the same experience that this guy had. I was just taken instantly back to when my grandpa used to grow tomatoes in our back garden in England. And that tomato that I had at Chef's Garden took me back to that moment. And it had been all these, 35 years or something since I'd experienced that feeling, that flavor of eating a tomato, because all of the ones I'd consumed since had been, commercially, industrially grown tomatoes that looked amazing, but really didn't taste of much. And that's what we want to do. We want to try to really appeal to the kind of emotional feelings of consumers so they can experience that again and realize that food should be something to be celebrated, not just something to get us through the day. And it's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That emotional tie to our food is a big deal. I mean, that maybe most everything as far as getting over that hump. For us at the market, it is so cool to have people have that moment where they flash back, right? And it reminds them of maybe shelling pecans or purple whole peas on the porch with grandpa or grandma. There's these wonderful memories that food elicits is really cool. So, Richard, to do it on the large scale that you're doing versus like the more centralized, it's just a local community. To me, it seems like we've got to have some major players in that retail space, which obviously more are coming on board, but also some major players in that distribution space. Is there anybody that seems to be really coming on, or do you think the distribution will come once the retailers want it?
Yeah, well, I think everything is going to be led by demand, and everybody is trying to work out, what's my reason for getting into this? Well, we're trying to create the reason by creating the consumer demand. And so with some of the supermarkets, we're trying to target existing programs and then work backwards through the supply chain. So perhaps there's a program of grass-fed beef, and then we're approaching them and finding out, who is the distributor that's got that grass-fed beef there, which farms involved in the production to give that supermarket chain that grass-fed beef every week of the year. And so that's been quite a successful way that we're trying to scale it by working, starting with the product and working backwards. That's certainly a way that has worked in other food types that Regenified is involved with. Remember, anything that's grown from soil can be verified by Regenified. So a couple of the supermarkets have approved Regenified as being the third party verifier to make sure all the claims are correct at that supermarket. So Whole Foods being one example of that. So Whole Foods said to all of their suppliers, if you want to put messaging on your pack in our store about regenerative agriculture or sustainability, we need you to be third-party audited. And Regenified, we have chosen to be the third party that can do that. So we've had some really interesting calls from people who make coffee, or Patch of Soap is another one. And then we work backwards from the store to work out, where do the ingredients of the soap come from? Where do the coffee beans, where are they grown? And then we'll go and visit them. We've had some wine and champagne brands and things like that are relatively simple to set up, because you start with a brand, then you work your way back through the distributor and back to the grower of where it comes from. And if the distributor has a market ready to go, such as a supermarket saying, hey, we want this coffee and we want it to come from this supplier, the distributors will all fall into place because they're going to make their money of getting the product from A to B. Probably most of them don't really care what that product is. As long as they've got weight on their trucks going from A to B, they're happy. And so by creating that by creating that demand, they will make sure that the supply falls in line. And that's why a big part of our strategy has been going directly to the ingredient manufacturers, to the brands, to the supermarkets, and oftentimes not to their buying departments, but trying to speak to the sustainability teams. Because as you start to get bigger in terms of, your Costco's and some of these giant retailers, it can be hard to get a buyer excited about wanting to buy these products, because many buyers may be primarily incentivized by price, the cheapest possible purchase price, selling it for the highest price, and that's how you make a profit. But we've been trying to appeal to the sustainability teams and helping them understand, my concept of the a la carte menu piece. If you buy rice from this guy, you're going to be able to talk about the carbon savings, the greenhouse gas emission savings, which will help you back in your boardroom when you're reporting to the board and your investors on how sustainable your business is. And then that sustainability team can then push that message sideways to the buyer and try to put pressure on the buying teams to start to engage with these regenerative supply chains, because they will then see the bigger benefit to the business and how it's worth getting involved in regenerative agriculture through Regenified.
Are y'all seeing more restaurants buying into this? Is there more of a emphasis on using regeneratively raised products in food service?
Yeah, there is. It's still in its early days, but obviously chefs, especially the better chefs, want ingredients that perform, meaning that are packed with flavor. And so it's been a really good marketplace to try to give, a chef is constantly thinking, why would a customer want to come to my restaurant rather than going to any other restaurants in the neighborhood, rather than cooking food at home? And the answer is he's got to create an emotional, immersive experience of why you want to go to the restaurant. And a big part of that is you want to make sure that every mouthful of food you have, you think to yourself, wow, this is really special. And so we've had some really good engagement with chefs starting to get on board. And in fact, Chef's Garden is a really good example of that, the vegetables and that they grow go directly to Michelin star restaurants around the country. And those chefs are starting to really understand the benefits of regenerative agriculture, because ultimately what they do is led by flavor, and regenerative agriculture produces food with more flavor than non-regeneratively produced food. And so they're a really good place to put that into action.
Are you seeing the meat side of all this fall in line with that assessment?
Yeah, I am. It's just much more complicated, because if you remember, cattle go to multiple locations from birth through to slaughter. And a big part of becoming verified with Regenified is we're interested in the whole life of the animal, not just the last 100 days or 120 days. It's the whole life, because we really want to be able to help the consumer know that that animal has been regenerating the earth, the soil, for its whole life, not just the last, we're not testing for the last few days, but for the whole life. So that does make it a little bit more complicated. But it also means that once we get these systems set up, then it's going to be harder to move them as well. So I think it'll be worth it. A big challenge in the pasture world is that every beef animal in the world starts off on pasture, and probably for 2/3 of its life it's on pasture. And there are various different ways of having cattle on pasture. Some are regenerative, some aren't. Roots So Deep is a very good film by Peter Bick, which explores the differences in that nuance, if any of your listeners want to go check that out. But anyway, then the animal reaches a fork in the road where it can either be finished on pasture, meaning spend get up to slaughter weight on pasture, or it takes a right-hand turn and goes into a feedlot. And the trouble is, once the animal gets into the feedlot, the good that it does in terms of regenerating the soil stops at that point. And at that point, that animal is just enterically emitting methane, meaning from the gut, so from the mouth. And that's definitely contributing negatively towards climate change because they're emitting way more carbon than what they're capturing. So we're out there trying to find more grass finishers who have got enough pasture to take cattle up to finishing weight. And that's our biggest challenge right now in the beef sector anyway. And so if you're listening to this and you're a farmer and you're finishing cattle on pasture, we'd love to talk to you about trying to incorporate you into our growing supply chains and connect you with a marketplace that is ready for this kind of product.
So would that look kind of like custom grazing, just finishing out custom grazing?
Yeah, so we've got guys who have pivots, meaning they've got irrigated land, and so they're able to grow grass all year round. Excuse me. I went on a road trip last summer with my last spring break rather with my 6-year-old, and we went to visit, in fact, all of the farms that were featured in Roots So Deep. And they were all doing amazing stuff. And by the way, it was super interesting to see how a 6-year-old can really engage and absorb, how proper food should be grown. That was, a big part of this puzzle, if we're to turn things around, is trying to teach our kids, the difference between proper food and, ultra processed food. And that was really interesting on that trip. But what was equally interesting was that all of those farms were raising the cattle regeneratively to a point, and then they get to that fork in the road. And unfortunately, because of convenience and a number of different factors, a lot of those animals were being sold off to a feedlot, and then they were getting lost in the system. And a big part of my mission is to unlose those cattle and keep the identity of them preserved and have them channeled into regenerative marketplaces. And so, yeah, it's trying to find enough finishing capacity around the country where we can channel farmers like that and their cattle into those type of finishing operations so that they can keep regenerating the soil, keep doing good, keep capturing all this carbon, and then getting onto the supermarket shelf where we'll be able to talk about the nutrient density and the nutrient richness of picking up that pack of ground beef versus any other pack of ground beef. And that's going to be a really important part of the mission.
Are there any states that stand out as being leaders in this?
Well, it's funny. I think I've spent the last 9-ish years here in the States growing and expanding the grass-fed beef movement. So 100% grass-fed beef, antibiotic-free, hormone-free. That was kind of what I was selling for the last 9 years. And it was always the two coasts that took on the concept first. The East Coast and the West Coast tend to be a little bit more progressive in their buying habits. And then from there, you kind of get that rippling effect and it starts to ripple into the country, into the rest of the country. I think that we're seeing the same with regenerative. It's another rabbit hole, but there's a huge challenge of food deserts. I've got farmers in the middle of, Missouri, and their nearest grocery store is quite a way away from where they live. And perhaps it's one of the big retailers like a Walmart, and they don't necessarily have access to some of this food. And so you tend to find that the coasts have much smaller, food deserts than the middle of the country. And with time, that's a challenge that I'd love to help to try to fix. And there are now increasing ways of getting food delivered directly to your house in some of these direct-to-consumer websites. One of my friends has a business called Perennial Pastures. He has Regenified cattle, and he sells quarter quarter animals and half animals, and if you buy a certain amount, you get a free chest freezer shipped to your house along with the meat. So there are definitely ways around that. But yes, to answer your question, you tend to find that the coasts are more progressive in their buying habits, but it will filter inwards. It was a happy day for me when I saw that Walmart had started stocking 100% grass-fed beef, because I knew that they wouldn't put it there because, they were staunch supporters of the movement. They're putting it there because they realize that the market has now matured enough that it's worth them having it on the shelf because it's going to sell. And that's thanks to, the work of the early pioneers on both coasts that gradually, have rippled out into all of their competitors till it gets to the point where they look around and think, right, we've also got to have grass-fed beef on our shelf because otherwise we're going to miss out on this movement. So, yeah, that was an interesting moment.
Well, it's all exciting. On each side, on the little level and on the bigger scale, I think we've got a lot of work to do. But I am extremely excited about the possibilities and love the work y'all are doing, and can't wait to continue the conversations.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think the biggest part of this whole deal is education and information. And so to have folks like you and your podcast getting that information out is critical to this movement really catching fire. And, like I said, trying to reach people who aren't necessarily worshipping at the Church of Gabe Brown, but actually start to realize the real benefits this will have on them and their families, whether that's the farmer who's starting to realize the resilience that this deal can bring to your family and your community, or whether it's from a community, from a consumer point of view, and the health aspect of eating food like this and how that will affect your life and your personal health. And that's all thanks to folks like you and putting out podcasts like this. So thank you for all of your tireless work for all this time that you've been doing.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate you. And again, sorry if the background noise was a little much. It definitely wasn't the optimal studio, but I think we did the best we could do. Richard, thank you again for your time, brother.
For every interview I ever do from now on, I need to have chickens clucking in the background. It definitely adds a layer of authenticity that I'm loving.
I've got one right here by my feet scratching in the leaves. I didn't know if y'all could hear that or not, but man, I appreciate you. Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.